So what we're going to do today is talk about web development just a little bit. This is tried to think of this in a way that it'll be accessible to just about anyone, whether you've done some coding, a lot of coding, no coding, and just kind of like doing some basics in a way that I'm hoping will be useful enough that you can like keep building on this if you want to, but it's a lot to get through in like 2 hours. So we'll do what we can. To get started, if you have a computer with you, please pull it out. There'll be a lot of playing along at home here, because I believe you can't learn any of this if you aren't doing it. So take a minute to grab your computer, and I'm going to have you install 2 things, and then we'll be off and running. It's these 2 things. If you already have a text editor that you like using, that's fine. If that doesn't mean anything to you, then just download Atom, and we'll take it from there. You can just go to atom.io and click download. And then after you do that, you can go to nodejs.org and hit download. Specifically there, Node has 2 packages available. Go with this one that says recommended for most users, which is 8.11.3. Just do that. That's an installer for both of those, and it'll just walk you through real quick. So here's what we're actually here to do now that we've done the prerequisites. Screens are scary things. This is probably my thesis or something. But like, I don't think people like screens inherently, except that they're like totally mesmerizing. It's this like really bizarre thing to design for, and like psychologically is just a very strange thing for us. So like designing for them is kind of this crazy wacko thing. Like this whole field of interaction design, like there's a reason that that's been like what we've been transfixed with for all these years. And then you put the internet on top of that and everything just gets totally crazy from there. So we're going to be talking mostly about kind of the technical aspects of that, and specifically wanted to start by just kind of level setting about like when these particular tools, and particularly like coding, is actually a useful thing for prototyping. So like, what is coding? What is all this about? Why are we bothering to learn this? When is this actually going to come in handy? So code's a super powerful tool. Like it lets you really abstractly do like really incredible things. It's this huge lever that you can move big old boulders with. But when we're designing, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to demonstrate an idea. We're not always trying to move boulders. So even when we're designing for a screen and ultimately we're designing something to be coded, code is not always the best way to demonstrate that. In fact, like it's usually not that great of a way. Like things like Figma and Sketch and these other tools where we can very quickly like mock something up are going to be much better for just showing off like the visual aspects of that. I mean, you all have probably already experienced this at some point. That's much quicker than actually coding it, right? So like those are definitely the tools that you still want to reach for when you're just trying to figure out what something's going to look like on a screen. But code is super useful when there are certain types of things that we want to prototype. Things like when you need to store and retrieve data as part of your prototype in order to make something that's compelling. When you need to move data between devices. If you need to retrieve data from some outside source. If you're accessing sensors, which could be things like temperature, light, if you're processing gestures somehow, or like cameras are really just a sensor. And also when you want to do something that is kind of like code native. A lot of that we generally put under like AI or machine learning. But if you want to use some feature that like happens in code, then you're going to need to obviously use code to prototype. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today, is like some tools that you can use to actually do that. Okay, so if you're totally new to coding, this is going to be my soapbox for a minute. So coding itself, like the basics of it, as like you might have encountered, like aren't necessarily crazy hard. And I find that there's kind of this gap between like, okay, I see these basics and that makes sense, but like how the heck do I actually do anything useful? And that's kind of like a divide that can be tough to bridge. And I think that there are 3 reasons in particular that happens. One is syntax. The thing with syntax is that those are just choices that people made to call things certain things. And if you're new to this, you just aren't going to know what people chose to call it. There's this inclination to be like, I don't know what I'm supposed to be putting in right now, so I must be dumb. And that's just like, it's not that, it's just you don't know, right? Like you haven't been around it, you don't know like what someone named that thing. So like, it just takes time to learn that. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're missing the point or you're misunderstanding it. Number 2 is abstractions. What I mean by that is like, basically like when you're making these code tools, again, it's a really powerful tool. Like you have this lever that can do so many different things. And that means that you make a lot of assumptions about exactly what is going to happen when you like write a line of code. And it takes a while to learn exactly, again, how someone else thought about those abstractions. So that can, again, be like a big hurdle to learning this stuff, is just like getting your head around what abstraction someone else had in mind. And finally, complexity. So like software engineers spend pretty much their entire careers trying to figure out how to deal with complexity in different ways. And it really increases exponentially. This very scientific graph here is talking about that. Like as you put more features into an application, complexity grows exponentially. Luckily, when we're talking about prototyping, that's not really our concern. So that's one we don't need to worry about as much. Like prototyping really kind of exists in this space where we don't have that many features included in it, and therefore we aren't dealing with a ton of complexity. So that's great. So all that is to say, don't feel dumb just because something seems weird. It's just probably syntax you don't know yet, an abstraction you haven't seen, or maybe things are starting to get complex. Anyway, let's make a website. Okay, so the rest of this is going to get pretty hands-on. That's why we had you download a text editor. So let's make a thing. All right. So I am also going to just pull up Atom here. I'm going to make a new thing. Okay, so if you want to open up Atom, I'm going to zoom in, and just open a new document. And what we're going to do is you can file save that, and we'll just call it index.html. You can make a new folder, call it whatever you want. I'm going to call mine After Dark Demo. Great. And I'm going to save that in there. And now here we are. Okay, so what we're looking at here, this is just a blank file. We're going to start writing some HTML, which is what makes a website. And it is just that. It's just a file with text in it that your browser knows how to turn into something more interesting than the text that you put into it. So let's get off and running. So to get started, HTML, you've seen this, is, it has these tags. We use the tag to denote what we're talking about, and then we use a slash to show that we've closed it. And everything that goes in between fits inside that tag. Great. So we're going to do this, which just is going to tell our browser, whatever else we're running this in, that this is HTML. And then we're going to create a body. We'll both open and close that. And that's just telling our browser that this is the body of the document. Now we can create an H1, which means it's the biggest of the headers that we're going to have. There's H1 all the way down to H6. We're going to say hi. Great. Now what we can do is if you go find that document, one way you can do it is by right-clicking here and going search in direct, or sorry, that's not what I meant, and go to show in Finder. Then we'll get it right there, and we can just open it, and look at that. It's a thing that says hi. Are we all here so far? How are we doing? Great, okay. Amazing. I have my little cue sheet over here. All right, so we're seeing a few different things in here. One that I just want to call out right now is that, so we have these things that open and close. We call those elements, is probably like the most common term that you'll hear for those. That'll be important later, but that's really all that is it just refers to a particular thing that's in between two of these tags that's open and closed. Now, what we can do is hop into making this look a little better. The quickest way to do that is we can use what's called inline styling, where we can just say style equals, and we can say, for example, color is red. And now we can go over here and refresh that, and boom, look at that. We now have a red hi. What could be greater? So yeah, so that's one way to do that. Another way that we can style things is we can go up here and we can create a block called style. We can say we want all H1s to be color green. And if we get rid of our former inline styling, you'll just need to refresh your browser every time you make a change, just because it won't know that you've done it unless you tell it. Okay, cool. So what we're getting into already is this thing up here is what we call CSS, which is a cascading style sheet. It's just the way that we assign styles to things in HTML. It's one of the more, it's one of these things that is super simple at its outset, like, right, this is super easy to read, it makes a ton of sense, but then gets complicated as you do more and more of it. So let's take we're not gonna spend a ton of time on CSS, but just to take a little bit more of a dive into generally what that looks like. Let's say we want to have 3 things. A really common element to use is this thing called a div, stands for division. Say this one's going to be my first thing. Then we're going to have one called my second thing. And finally, my third thing. Great. And now say we want those to, first let's put them all in a different font face. Sorry, font family, thank you. We want them to be sans serif. Your browser has a built-in sans serif. If you're on a Mac, it's Helvetica. If you're on Windows, it's Arial. And so it's just making a decision for you there. And you'll find a lot of shorthands like that built in. That's why we can just say green instead of needing to be more specific about that. We can also be more specific. And we can, for example, say it as a background color of yellow. This is going to pick up a bit, don't worry. Okay, and now let's say we wanted to position these so that they are side by side instead of one below another. There are a lot of different ways that we can do this, and exactly how you want it to do it is that's really the practice of learning CSS. Is it takes time to get your head around exactly what that is. But just to give you an example, we can say display inline block, and what that's going to do is now it's going to treat this as an inline element, so the same way that it might treat something like text. So it basically thinks of each one of these blocks as being like a word, and it's just sort of floating them all together. So that's one way we can do that. One more thing to call out here is, so what if we have another div and we don't want it to be styled the same way? This is my other thing over here. And what gives, because all of our divs are going to be styled the same way. So what we can do is, it's actually, usually you're not going to want to style all things of a particular class or of a particular type the same way. So instead what we can do is we can give it a class that can be whatever we want. Usually you'll use a hyphen to denote it. That's just a convention, doesn't really matter. So we can say all of these things have a class of thing. And then our other thing has a class of other thing. And now we can go back up here. And instead of giving all these styles to the div, we can say dot is how we say that it's a class thing. And look at that. So now only these things that have the class of thing are styled that way, and our thing with the class of other thing, I could have named it something different for speaking cadence, but here we are, is not styled that way. Great. So far, so good. Any questions, objections, pleas to talk about something else? Okay, cool. We'll keep going. One other thing that I want to call out at this stage is that a lot of places where CSS can get kind of wacky is when you start thinking about the ways that elements fit inside each other. So we'll have things like what you might call like a wrapper element, which is just an element that has other elements inside of it. So when we just do this, it's not going to make any difference. But we can go up here and do something like and tell it to display as what's called a Flexbox, and that's going to change around what happens here. And then similarly, that's going to give us new things that we can do up here. I'm intentionally not spending time on exactly what this is doing. The idea is really just that, like, without this, without that bit, that changes around how the children elements here are going to behave. And there are like any number of little gotchas with that in CSS. But what that turns into is that, like, really being able to think through the structure of your document before you start making it is kind of incredibly important. So that's one of those reasons that I'd really recommend that you don't, even if you're feeling like really confident with code, code's usually not going to be the most efficient place to start making something. That's starting in a system where you can just kind of like drag things around, for example, without changing your assumptions, is going to be much quicker. Already alluded to a bunch of this, but just like we're gonna move on from CSS because that could easily be the next week by itself. Just wanted to give you kind of like the idea of what that looks like. But some things to know. One is that there are almost always multiple ways that you can accomplish the same thing in CSS, which can be like a little bit maddening sometimes, but really just means, number two, that it just takes time to master. And if you just do it, you'll start learning more. It's not a hard thing to just start doing if it's something that you're excited about, and you'll start getting your head around it more and more as you do it more, and start building up an intuition for like different ways to do it. And then that last one we were just talking about, that it's always easier to write CSS if you know exactly what you're trying to code. So it's much more of a tool for making something than designing something. What was that thing about data? Remember earlier we were talking about how great it is that we can move data around, and that's why we'd prototype in code? What was that all about? That's what we're going to talk about now. Is that all this slide is? Okay, no, okay, there's this slide. All right, so we've talked about HTML, we've talked about CSS. The third thing that you generally hear grouped in terms of just sort of like fundamentals of web development is this thing called JavaScript. So it's a programming language. It runs in browsers, and in fact, it's the only language that can run in a browser. And it can be used to change what's displayed on the page. It can do that in any number of increasingly sophisticated ways, but that's really what it allows you to do. So it makes it so we have like this static document we were just looking at. If you want to be able to change that around and have someone interact with it, JavaScript will let you do that. It's a pretty like quick language to work in. That's again because of like the particular kind of abstractions that are built into it. And this is just kind of an aside, but computer scientists like really don't like JavaScript for any number of reasons. But they're all very like nerdy and don't matter if you're just thinking about making prototypes. I'm personally a fan, so there. Okay, let's get started. All right, so the fun thing about JavaScript is that you're using it all the time, even when you don't realize it. So what I just did is I opened this thing called the console in my browser, and the way I did that is on a Mac, I hit Command Option I, or we can go to we can go to View, Developer, JavaScript Console. It's probably similar if anyone's on a PC. And now we have this thing open. And now we have this weird caret and this thing flashing at us. And this is in fact, a JavaScript console. So you are now looking at JavaScript. Does everyone see something that looks something like this? Great, OK. So what we can do, this is great. We can just go 1 + 1, and it gives us 2. Amazing! We just did JavaScript. So this is what's called an interactive console. So we type one line of code, it runs that one line. And it's a great way to just kind of like see how the syntax works. So, that means that we can do things like basic math, like 3 times 4. Great. It means that there are other similar things that we can do, like if we want to say this plus is great. It'll put that all together. It says this is great, because it's great. Okay. Where this actually starts getting relevant is, or one thing to touch on here is a variable is just like a really useful thing to start getting your head around early on in JavaScript. So we can go ahead and define one of those. We can just say variable my variable equals 1. And now, if we type in my variable, it's 1. So a variable is really just storing a value that we can come back and use later. And there are a number of different types of things that we can put into variables that we're going to talk about in just a minute. But first, what we're going to do is we're going to transition from writing JavaScript here to writing JavaScript in here. And the reason we're going to do that is because, like, obviously we're not going to interact with our website by typing in the console. We're going to interact with it by using our website. So if we go back over to Atom, just the same way that we did style in a block like that, we're going to say script. Oh, script. So we'll open and close that. And now, so we had just defined this variable over here called my variable. We're going to do exactly the same thing over here. We're going to start off, let's in this time say my number. My number is 3. You can pick your own if you like, if you're playing along at home. And then we've done that. We can come refresh here, and magically, my number, look at that. So my number is now, what we would say is it's defined in this context. So we've created it here. So when this page is loaded in, when your browser is parsing through this, which it does from top to bottom, it's reading this style, then it gets here, it sees this variable, it creates that. That's now in this JavaScript context, then it goes on and it renders your page based on this HTML. So that's cool. So we can create these things in the page, and now they're accessible in the console. Great. And again, so there are different types of these variables that we can create. Like numbers are useful, but they're not the only thing we want. Another one that we might play with is a thing called a string. It's a string of characters. And that can be, that's basically what you're going to use whenever you need to like store text or anything like that. The final what we call primitive type that you use is what's called a Boolean. So a Boolean is just something that's either true or false, as you probably know. And again, for example, my Boolean is now available over here. And then there are other types that we can get into that really just start putting these things together. So for example, one called an array is just, it's a list of things. And in JavaScript, it can be any combination of these things. So we now have an array that has these 3 things in it. We refresh this, we'll see that over here. And what's interesting about arrays is that it's storing these values, and like often what we might want to do is get just one of those values back. And the way we do that is we can go in here, and then we just use a square bracket, and we can use what's called the index of the item that we're looking for, and that just means like what number is it in order. So we can say my array of 1, and it gives us this thing. Now, it's interesting that it gives us this thing and not 2, because 2 is the first thing in there. The reason for that is because, like most programming languages, JavaScript is 0 indexed in arrays, so it starts with 0 instead of starting with 1, which is for annoying reasons. But that's like definitely an early gotcha. How are we doing? Feeling good? Great. Okay. Next type that we can talk about, very similar to an array, is what we call an object in, ooh, now it's after dark. What we call an object. And what that'll let us do is, it's quite similar to an array in that we're putting multiple things into it. But what it lets us do is instead of just having things that are just kept by their order, we can keep things by a name. So for example, we could have an object called me. And there we can have name. And I'm going to use a string. I'm going to say my name's Parker. And then we can also have like my age. Jacob over here dating me. I can say I'm 27. And we can have my birthday, which is going to be October 11th. Great. Now we refresh that. We go in here, and look at that. It's me. Now, if we want to get one of these things back, like if we have this thing called me, and it's like, okay, that's all well and good, but what I really want right now is I just want to get one of those things. Like I just want the string for my name. Again, just notation. The way we do that is me dot, and then the name of, we call this a key. So we can say me dot name. Boom. Look at that. Similar to an array that we can like sort of look up things that are inside it, but it means that we can do it by name. So we were talking a bunch about Json, that guy Json that came up. So what Json is it's just a way of making this, this is called an object. It's a way of making an object portable. What you're actually looking at here is a representation of what's being stored by your computer in memory, and it's representing that to you in a way that that's readable for you, because that's what it's written to do. What JSON does is it turns that into a format that looks very similar, but makes it portable across devices. So for example, we can say json.stringify. So what that's doing is it's turning it into a string, me. Helps if you spell it right. Stringify. Great. So you can see this looks very similar, but it's been done in a way that it's now all in one string. The reason for that is like, this is again just like one of those weird kind of things about just the way that computers work, is strings are very standardized across programming languages, whereas like exactly what this would look like represented in memory is not. So it means that if we're going to move data from one place to another, we'll often represent it as the this JavaScript object notation, which is what JSON stands for. So cool. Just wanted to pause on that while we were on objects. What do we talk about next? All right. So we have this data. Like we have all this stuff about me in here. Isn't that exciting? But like, okay, we can see it in the console. Not that helpful. How are we actually going to make that something that like someone can see? The easiest way to do that, well, okay, so let's say JavaScript has the ability, as I was saying, to change what's on the page. That's built in natively to JavaScript. I didn't talk about functions. Just kidding, we're going to do one other thing first. So there's one other type that we should know about, which is called a function. So variable my function. So again, this behaves just like a variable in JavaScript. And it has this weird syntax where we say function, because we're just telling JavaScript that it's a function, and then we put in some kind of input. And then what this function is going to do is it's going to do something with that input, and often it will return some kind of output. In this case, why don't we say that it's going to take an input, it's going to add 1 to it. So we're going to define output equals input plus 1, and then we're going to return that output. Great. So we've defined that. We go over here and refresh it. And now we'll see we have my function. We can say my function 1, and it says 2. We can say my function of 4, and it says 5. So it looks very similar to like math notation you might have used at some points. But this is a really powerful component of, I mean, just programming in general, because it means that you can define some sort of thing that needs to happen and then make it really easy to do it again. So if you can imagine this not being 2 lines, but 1,000 lines of code, but then you can reference it and call it with just 1 line. So it makes it really easy to move around really sophisticated functionality. Great. Now that we've talked about that, what we're going to do is we're going to import a whole bunch of functions that someone else wrote to help us change around what's happening in the browser. It's this thing called Jquery. Jquery.com. So you can see Jquery talking about itself, and this is all probably fairly esoteric at this point. We don't actually need to download Jquery. Instead, this might be a little bit of hand waving, but we're going to look for what's called a Jquery Cdn, which stands for Content Delivery Network. And basically, this is a way to be able to load in all of this JavaScript without needing to like manually download it. So we're just going to load it from their server, and that just saves us from needing to like download it and have it locally. So you can just copy this script tag if you've made it to the same place I have. What I'd recommend is going to jQuery 3.x, clicking on uncompressed, and that'll give you this thing. We can just copy that. We'll go back over here, and boom. So we can paste that in just above our other script tag that we had. And all it's saying, it works the same way as the script tag does. There's just a bunch of JavaScript in here, and it's just saying we're going to load it from this URL, and then we're going to run it. Yeah, so what that's going to do for us, we can take a look at what it actually looks like if you're curious. So this is jQuery, and you can see a bunch of things that look very similar to the sorts of things we were just doing. We're defining a bunch of variables. Here's like an empty object that we're going to use later. Got a bunch of junk that looks confusing, but just takes some time to get used to exactly what it is. But the whole point is that this is just running a bunch of JavaScript that is going to make it so we can now use a whole bunch of really convenient functions that other people have written for us. Great. Let's talk about what it does. So this is generally what it looks like when you do something in jQuery. You're going to, this $sign thing is just what jQuery uses as the name of like the master function. What we're gonna put into that function is the name of an HTML selector, just the same way we did when we were styling things with CSS earlier. We're gonna do some kind of action on it. This is just an example, this add class action. And then we're gonna give some sort of parameters to that function to tell it what exactly we're gonna do. Does that make any sense, roughly? Okay, cool. So let's try that out. What's fun is if we go back to our thing here and we refresh the page, you'll see if you just type in $sign and press enter, it's going to give you all this gobbledygook, which is just, that's what the function itself for jQuery looks like. But that's all. What matters about that is we now know that it's defined in our browser. So why don't we go back in here, back into our CSS. And remember we had this thing earlier that were our little, my first thing, my second thing, my third thing. And let's go down here and make another class called another thing. And let's give that a font size of, I don't know, 125 pixels. Something nice and big. And so now that's just sitting there at the moment, right? We're not actually doing anything with that because we don't have any classes down here that have, or we don't have any elements in our HTML that have the another thing class on it. So it's not actually going to change anything about the way our page is styled if we go over here and refresh it. But what we can now do is we can go in, we can go into our console and we can actually type exactly that thing we just had. We can say, we can take this class, so the class dot thing. We're going to say add class a function defined by jQuery. We're going to say another thing. I'll zoom in a bit. And when we do that, what this is saying is it's going to take all of the things that have the class thing, every element, so these 3 divs that we had down here, and it's going to give them all a second class of another thing. So when we do that, look at that, everything gets huge. How fun. So like that's kind of cool that we can do that. If we want to go back the other way, jQuery also has a function defined called remove class, so we can get rid of those. Great. But you might say, we're still doing all this in the console. You lied to me. I was promised that we'd have fun interactive web apps. Fear not. We're about to add what's called a button. It's very similar to a button. OK, so what we're going to do is create an element called a button, and we're going to give it a class of, let's call it bigger. Make it bigger. So this works the same way as those other elements, so that it's just an element called a button. We go over here, and now there's our button. At the moment, it doesn't do anything. We can click on it all we want. It's not going to do anything. But with the magic of jQuery, we can make it do something. The way we're going to do that is back up in our script. We're going to do another really cool capability that jQuery has is to, the fancy way to say it is to attach an event listener. All that means is it's going to listen for a particular event, and when that event happens, it's going to do something. So in this case, we're going to take this class .bigger, and we're going to listen for a click. There's a shorthand for that that's just .click. And now what we're going to do is we need to tell it what we want it to do when something gets clicked on. The way we do that is we actually write a function inside of a function. So what we're doing here is we're defining a new function. And what we're doing with that function is we're going to say exactly what we just did. We're going to say take all of the thing elements and add the class, another thing. A gotcha here that I'll just point out is when you use this add class function, you don't want a dot before it because it's going to add it. It's going to add this literal string. It doesn't need the dot selector the way we did here. If that was a confusing statement to you, ignore it. Great. OK, so now we've defined that, and we go over here, and we click on our button, and for some reason, this isn't getting bigger. This is because of another gotcha that I'm making a big show of because this will drive you insane. So again, we were talking about how your browser executes this whole document from top to bottom. So as it's doing that, it reads the style, reads the script. There's a funny thing that happens where when it reads this is the moment where it's going to look for all elements called bigger to attach this event listener to. The problem is it hasn't actually read the bit where it created that button yet. So it's not going to be able to find it to attach it to. So what we can do is we can take both of our script tags here, and we can just cut them. And the convention is usually to put it right at the bottom of the body. What that does for us is it means that our JavaScript is only going to run once all of those HTML elements are loaded in. So we know that they already exist once we're trying to manipulate them, which can do us a lot of favors. OK, now that we've done that, let's go over here and try that. Make it bigger. Amazing. Look how much bigger. Just for continuity, let's go make another button. Let's call it smaller. Make it smaller. And we're going to follow basically the same logic here. So we can just say when we click on the smaller thing, we're just going to, instead of adding that class, we're going to remove it. So we refresh, we can make it bigger, and then we can make it smaller. We can make it bigger again. Cool. Let's go to the jQuery documentation and see what it has for us. API documentation. Great. So there are kind of a lot of them. I mean, there you can see add class that we just used. Some of these don't worry about right now. We can use things like Animate that is a little bit complicated to use, but you can animate an element with. Append that you can use to add another HTML element like onto or after another HTML element, or like at the bottom of it. We can use looking for ones that are easy to define. Children, so if we wanted to see, if we like select a particular element and we want to see everything that like is nested under it, children can do that. Click that we saw before, similar to click, there's also like hover, so we can trigger events based on when you hover over something, which is kind of fun. There's also, I think that there's a double click event built in here. CSS, yeah, there's double click. CSS is one that we can actually use to set style properties inside of jQuery. So yes, there are a whole bunch of them in here. Just about any way that you'd want to die, for example, that you'd want to like play around with what they call the DOM, document object model, that you want to play around with your HTML. You can do it in jQuery, and they've given you like pretty convenient ways to do that. Okay, so say we don't just want this to get bigger all at once, but instead we want it to transition from being smaller to being bigger. We can do that with the magic of CSS. So on our thing class, we can say transition, and the way this works is first we're going to tell it what property we want to transition. So in this case, we want the font size to transition. And then we want to tell it how long it's going to take it. So we can say, for example, 500 milliseconds. And now what's going to happen, if we go over here, refresh it, when we make it bigger, you can see it slowly becomes bigger. It transitions through all those sizes. There's some other fun things that you can do here with, like, for example, are called the easing properties, and that's like, do you want that transition to happen linearly, or like slowly and then quickly, or slowly then quickly then slowly? So we can say, for example, ease in out, which will make it happen, I guess, more slowly, then more quickly, then more slowly. So if we put this up to like 800 milliseconds, we might see like, that's kind of like a default way that a lot of apps will use now to just make things feel like smoother, because it has a really nice kind of really nice physics to it. It just feels nice, versus like linear feels a little different. So I mean, this is just all to say that like there are a lot of different ways that you can play around with this stuff, and a lot of different ways that you can like make things more interesting and make them more exciting to use. Okay, cool. So we've done those things. And now on the topic of other things jQuery can do, holy smokes, all of this data is still just in this one page. And I thought we were going to do cool things with moving data around. Fear not. What we're going to do now is we're going to get data from a third-party API. Probably heard the term API. It's an application programming interface. All it means is that it's something that someone else has put on the internet that we can interact with. In this case, there's a really easy to use one, getting the time, that I thought was the first hit when you searched for time APIs earlier. Hang on, don't worry, I have a backup. Nope, it's right here. Okay, great. So if we go to worldclockapi.com, so this is just a page for this API that's telling us about what's available. And the first thing you can see here is this Eastern Standard Time. So that's what we call an API endpoint, which is the same thing as a URL, right? It's just a different term for it. We have that endpoint, and we can go right in our browser to that endpoint, and we can see what comes back is a bunch of our friend JSON over here. And what it's telling us is it's like a bunch of very specific things about the current time. So it's telling us like the current time itself. It's telling us what time zone we're in. That's UTC offset, how far removed we are from Greenwich. Is it daylight savings time? You know, these sorts of things. Great. So that's cool. That data is available there. But now what we want to do is we want to actually get it into our website. And the way we're going to do that is, again, using jQuery. This time, since what we're starting with isn't like an element that's on our page, we're using a different function inside jQuery. And the way jQuery handles that is, instead of saying $ parentheses, we're going to say $ dot, in this case, get. The thing we're going to get is this API. So we're going to want to make sure that that's in quotes, so that it knows that it's a string, because otherwise it would try and treat it as a variable and it would get very confused. So we're going to tell it what we're getting, and now again we need to tell it what we're going to do with whatever comes back. So we're going to define a function, and that function is going to, how you can think of it is that we're defining a function that's going to get handed the result of this, if that makes sense. So what jQuery is going to do is magically go to this endpoint, this URL. It's going to get the result of it, and then it's going to say, all right, now tell me what you want to do with it. So give me a function that will take the result of that, which I should probably call it result. And we're going to do something with it. In our case, why don't we start by just saying console.log result. Console.log just means what you might expect it to mean, that it's just going to pop out into our console as it comes back. So if we go over here and we refresh the page, great. You can see what's just come back from here is this exact thing that we just saw in JSON here. But what jQuery has done for us is it's already turned it back into a variable. So we aren't seeing this as a JSON string. We're seeing this as an object in memory. So that's cool. Now that we have that data, we can, for example, why don't we go back up to our HTML and put in somewhere that we want to put that data? So why don't we create let's just create a new div to wrap some things in. And we can say the time is. Now we're going to introduce a new type of element called a span. A span is like we changed those divs to being inline earlier. That's really all a span is it's just an inline element. What that'll mean is that instead of automatically going on the next line, it'll just flow right in line here. And we can give this class of time. So now that we have our new thing, our new element there, what we can do is when we get that result, we can take our time element, and what we can do is set the HTML of it to be the result, which again is this object. Let's not just set it to be the result, let's set it to be the result.current date time. So now when this page runs, we can see it's saying the time is from the thing we just wrote, and it's going and getting the time, and it's putting it right in here live. You can see that little flicker that happens. That's because as this is working now, it's loading in the HTML. After it loads the HTML, it starts running our JavaScript. And that's when it goes and gets that thing and then puts it into the document here so that we can actually see it. So the flicker is the time in between when the page loads and when it finishes going and getting that other piece of data and bringing it back and putting it in there. Cool. So yeah, so again, so this function is only going to run when the page loads right now, but we can totally change that. A cool way to do that, or probably the most straightforward way to do that, is we can say set interval, and then what this thing does, I'll just write it out shorthand. So it's going to take a function that does something. So again, this is the same as when we defined this function here. And then we're going to run it on some interval of milliseconds. So we can say every 1,000 milliseconds, we're going to do something. So to get started and show that, we can start by just saying console.log, hey. So we go, great. Go back over here. We can see this number is giving us how many times it's logged this out. We can see every second it's saying hey. So now you can see that if we just take this whole block where we're doing that get request and we're putting that time in and we move that inside the center interval. Now when we go here, you'll see that's actually updating every second. Computers are fun. What else we got? I can do this all day long.
What about bringing in sensor data?
Sensor data? What a great idea, Jacob. Remember that time earlier when we downloaded that thing called Node? Let's do something with that. Okay, so things are about to get a little bit crazy. We're going to go from our nice friendly Atom to, we're going to go to the command line. Yes, yes, this is going to be great. So if you're on a Mac, you can just open up Terminal. If you can't find it, you can just Spotlight search for Terminal, and you'll find it there. I don't know if we have anyone on Windows machines who's actually playing along. Windows machines have command prompt, which is somewhat similar. But for Mac folks, so here we are in the terminal. Where you're probably at is you probably see something that's like the name of your computer or something, and then like your username or something like that. I'll zoom in a little bit more. And what this is telling you is that we're just at the root directory of your computer right now. So to see that, we can type ls, and that just means list, and that's going to list everything that's in that place right now. So this is all the junk that I have sitting in the root directory of my computer, which is super fun and exciting. For example, if I wanted to change directories, for example, if I want to go into my CoLab directory, I can do that. I can do ls again, and now I can see everything that I have in my CoLab directory. So if, this is just very basic using a command line. It's no different than what you might do in Finder here, right? So this is like cding into a new folder, and ls, I can see everything that's in there. Something we can do real quick, because what we want to do is get to the directory that you've created for this. So mine's called After Dark Demo. We can actually just drag that into, this will actually want to do cd, and then drag that into the terminal. And that'll give us the directory that it's located at, so we can automatically jump over there. Number 4, getting data from your own source. So we used that public API that was available. What if we want to make our own API that we can get data from? How do we do that? Great question. So we're going to use this thing called Node that you downloaded earlier. Node is also JavaScript. This is this kind of wacky thing that happened in the last 5 or 10 years. That JavaScript was written specifically to be a browser language. Some folks decided, wouldn't it be cool if we could run it outside the browser? Part of the reason for that was honestly just because people who were used to writing JavaScript in a browser wanted to be able to write JavaScript other places because they liked it as a language. And now it's one of the biggest server languages going, which is kind of cool. So we can make servers with it. A server is just a thing that we use to make an API available. And we're going to make one right now. let's play. That's what that says. Great. Okay. So the reason that we're here on the command line is because we're going to need to do a few things that we don't necessarily have a GUI for, which is very fun and exciting. So along with Node, you probably installed a thing called NPM, which stands for Node Package Manager. Now, what that is and why it exists is like the same way that we loaded jQuery from an external resource. That's a really common thing in software, to be able to want to use packages that like other people have made, because like not everything's built into the language itself. So NPM is just the package manager that Node uses. So we're going to need to use that in a second. And in order to use that, we're going to start by turning our current directory into just the right environment for that. So we're going to say npm init. Did that work for everyone? Great. So you can just press enter through all of this. This is like if you were to set this up as itself a package, you could do those things. But we don't need to like put in like a description of this project or anything for now. But now what we can see is there's this thing called package.json in here. What that does is that's just going to tell us about this thing that we're making. And importantly, it's going to tell us what dependencies it has. And that's really just like what pieces of code, what packages need to be loaded in order to use this package. So for us, the one that we're really going to use here is this thing called Express. So to install it, we're just going to say npm install Express, and then we're going to say -- save. And I'll show you why we did that save in just a second. Great. So we did that npm install Express, and what the save did is we can see this is our package.json. This is what it looked like before, just like boilerplate information. And now we can see this, we have this dependencies Express here. And that's where we're keeping track of the fact that Express is a thing that we're going to use. Okay, now you might be asking yourself, what the heck is Express? So the same way that jQuery builds on top of just built-in JavaScript functionality to make it easier to do certain things in the browser, Express is kind of like that for Node servers. So like this is all things that Node can do in the language, but they've just made it much easier for us. So it's like a go-to for a lot of people. Great. So now what we can do is, well, we can go back into Atom, and we should see, I'm in a couple directories deep here, but should see a few things here. You can see your index.html that we were working on. You'll see your package.json that we just created, and there's this node modules thing, which is where Express was just installed into. And you can see, this is a little bit of an aside, but you can see like these are all of the dependencies that Express relies on, and those were all installed like recursively when we did that. So it's this kind of crazy thing, and this is what's super cool about open source software, is that just there's a ton of different packages that get used to do just about everything now, and just a lot of people maintaining that. So it's a cool world. But what we're going to do is we're going to make a new file. We're going to call it server.js. This is, as you might have guessed, on its way to being our server. And now we're going to do the thing that I do literally every time I make a new Express server, and I'm going to say Express hello world. Hello world, like coming from computer science, is kind of a thing that is just sort of like when you're going to do the most basic thing with something, that's called the hello world example. Like how do you get this thing to just say hello to the world? So this is that for Express, this thing right here. So if you pull that up, we're just going to copy and paste that. So we're going to bring that from there into here. So let's take a second to look at what's actually happening here. So there are some things that Node introduced that don't work natively in the browser. So this is where things get a little bit weird. Particularly this thing called require. that's what we're using to import this Express module. Browsers don't have that natively. The reason for that is actually security. Because when we're doing this, it's accessing the file system on our computer to get Express as a file. Browsers are very carefully designed so that they have really controlled access to your computer's file system, because that way someone can't write a website that's going to be able to like get into your computer. So that's a very roundabout way of saying this exists here, it doesn't exist in your browser. But it's the kind of node equivalent of saying what we did just a few minutes ago, where we loaded this thing from jQuery. So it's a very similar way of saying the same, or it's a very similar way of doing a similar thing. Just here, instead of loading it in from like this other place where it's hosted, we're loading it from our own machine. But in both cases, we're loading it, and then it's making new things available to us here. Here. Great. So we've loaded it in. Now we're going to create this thing called app. The way we do that is we just call express as a function, and what that will return to us is this thing called app. Const means, for all intents and purposes, the same thing as var that we were using earlier. So it's just saying these are variables with those names. And then here we're finally going to get to the meat of it. Now that we have this thing called app, we can actually create our web server. So we're going to say app.get, and what that means is it's going to say, when someone tells me that they want to get something from me, this is what we're going to do. So in the same way, earlier we had, let me change the syntax a little bit. Earlier we had those like, when someone clicks on this, do this. That's the same thing we're doing here. We're saying when someone makes what's called a GET request, it's just, that's like what your browser does. Like when you go to a website, it's making a GET request. When someone makes a GET request to just slash, meaning that it's not like slash my homepage, that it's just the root, as we call it, that this is how we're going to handle it. And that's a function that takes two things, a thing called rec, which is short for request, and that's an object that contains everything we might want to know about the incoming request, and then res, which is an object that gives us everything we need to reply to that request, so to respond. So request and response. Great. So we've defined what this server is going to do. It's just going to do this one thing. It's just going to say hello world when someone goes to that URL. And then app.listen, we're just going to start the server. This number that we're putting in here is what's called the port that we're listening on. It's kind of semantic, and it'll make more sense in just a second what that actually means. Great. So we've just created a server. So if we go back to our command line, and we're still in this directory, what we can do now is we can just say node server.js. And we can see, we're seeing printed out exactly what we had here, that our example app is now listening on port 3000. Great. And now how do we actually find that? What does that mean? If we go back to our browser, we can go to localhost and then colon. This is where that port comes in, 3000. Localhost is basically just, it's how your computer finds itself. It's this kind of weird thing where when you have a server running on your own computer, it needs to be able to find it, and localhost is how we do that. And then the port is like is just like another way of kind of being specific about where it's looking for it. So we go to localhost 3000, and look at that, hello world. Great. That was a lot really quickly. Any questions? Okay. It takes a little while for some of this stuff to actually like sink in, but thanks for bearing with me. So, all right, we did that. Now, what if instead of just getting hello world, we wanted to get something more interesting? Like say we had some kind of, I don't know, let's say we have a variable here called counter. Sorry, that's not how we do that, var counter, and we're going to set it equal to 0. And what we want to do is we want to count how many times someone's been to this domain, or has been to this, this server. Now we're going to res.send counter. first so far. Oh. We're gonna have to restart the server every time we change something. It's just a thing. We can actually fix that really quickly if you guys want to do another fun thing. No, too many things at once. Okay, node server. Hang on. Oh, I know why it doesn't like that. Okay, so it wanted this to be a string. I thought we could be clever and skip a step, but we can't. So this is fun. We got an error here. This is a cool thing that Express does. It's telling us what went wrong when we screwed up. And in this case, the reason that we screwed up is because this res.send function wants it to be a string, and we gave it a number. So it's kind of confused about why it's getting a number. What it specifically means by this invalid status code thing is that there are certain status codes that we use on the internet to just tell, for one thing to be able to tell another, like, how did this go? So like when you see 404 as one that you see a lot, that's just a status code for couldn't find that resource. There are also like 302 for like a redirect, or like 500 for something went wrong, which is what happened in this case. So what we're going to do instead of that is, instead of saying res.send, we're going to say res.json. And all that means is that we're going to convert the thing that we're sending into JSON. So we're going to turn it into a string, and then we're going to send it. And we're going to put an object in there where we're just going to have a thing called counter. So this is the name of that thing in there, and we're going to set it equal to the value counter, which is up here. Great. Oh, and now we're going to need to restart our server again. Oh, I should have mentioned this. To make your server quit, it's just Control-C when you're in the terminal. So when you're there, I press Control-C, and that'll quit out. And then you can press up is a shorthand for just show me the last thing that I typed in on the command line. Okay, so now we're getting that counter back. At the moment, it's still just always giving us 0. What if we go back in here and make it so every time someone requests this page, we're going to say counter equals counter plus 1. So we're going to make that 1 value bigger, and then we're going to send it. Then we press Control-C, we press node server. And now, well, look at that. Isn't this fun? But what we've basically done is this is sort of like the most basic possible version of a database, in a sense, right? That we now have this number that's being stored here on this server, and if anyone were to go to this server, they'd see the same number. So if we had, like, for example, a prototype where we needed to have some number that's shared between a bunch of devices, like, that's all you'd really need to do it. As long as you can have that number on the server, it can be available to any number of devices.
Where is that data stored?
So it's stored in memory. So what that means is just that, like, that variable exists in the memory on that server. So as long as that server's on, it's gonna contain that. Which is the simplest way to do a data store, is just to keep it in the memory. It's not very scalable because, like, as you probably know, like from your computers, like you have RAM and you have a hard drive. Your hard drive is much bigger than your RAM because it's more expensive and harder to maintain. So it's the same phenomenon here, that it's easier to put something into a data store that's big than it is to, like, keep everything in RAM. So that's kind of fun. And why don't we?
I'm sorry, is that an explanation for why I have a server?
Oh, that was an explanation for, so yeah, so Jacob was asking, like, where is this thing actually being stored? So, like, I was saying, this is the most basic version of a database, in a sense. What you'd actually do if you needed to store, like, a bunch of data is you'd introduce essentially another server that is itself, what it does is stores data. And in that case, it does a lot more sophisticated things to manage exactly where and how that data is stored, so that you can have a lot of it, is the big difference. And that's so you can have it persist, is the other advantage. Because, like, here, like, if we turn this server off, the number that our counter's at is going to go away. It'll be 0 again when we start it back up. So what we do instead is we have some sort of data store that it's the equivalent of, like, storing it on a hard drive versus having it in memory. is like a rough analogy. Why don't we go back to, just tie this all together, let's go back to our HTML here, and let's get our counter and bring it in. So we're going to do this the same way we did our time thing. So we can just copy that and bring it down. And we can say the count is, let's say, count. And then we can use basically the same code that we used for this other GET request, except for instead of going to HTTP world clock API, what we can do is go to HTTP localhost 3000. We'll get that result, and instead of putting it on time, we'll put it on count. And instead of all of that, it'll be result.counter. Great. And now, when we go over here, oh, I'm going to the wrong place. When we go over here, oh yeah, it is going to be upset about that, isn't it? So what we've just encountered is your first ever CORS error, which is a beer, but is also, this is another case where browsers have done a lot to protect us from ourselves. In this case, browsers are really hesitant to let you access resources that are hosted on a different domain than the domain that you're currently on. So what are, for example, what our browser's seeing here is that we're at this URL and we're trying to load something from a totally different URL. So it's like, what gives? Is this malicious? I'm afraid of this. This is scary. So what we can do is we can quickly make it so these things are instead being served from the same domain. So let's go into our server.js. And we can say app.use, which is just a shorthand way of saying, like, this is a thing that we're adding into our application. Express.static. And then we'll just do this and then describe what it says. And then /public. What we're doing here is we're saying app.use, so express do this thing, and then express.static is a helper for us to create what we call a static endpoint. So like Fahad was just talking about, like, we can have this server in addition to serving something like a dynamic asset, like my value. I'm in the wrong thing here. I had two of these open. Server.js, great. So instead of thing like counter that we had here, that's something that's dynamic, we can also serve things statically, which would mostly just refer to like files. So all this public thing means is that we're going to, oh, yep, thank you. So in this After Dark demo, we can create a new folder that's called public. And now what we've done is this is going to make it so everything that's inside that folder called public is going to be available to anyone who goes here. So we can take our index.html and we just move that inside the public folder. And now we're going to need to restart our server again. And if we go to localhost 3000, we're still seeing the counter. Why would that be? The reason for that is you can see they're actually competing for that particular endpoint right now because it expects both our index.html and this app.get to be in the same place. So let's just change this to be app.getCounter. So now if we restart this, this is just instead of being there, it's available at app.getCounter. And what should be available here, Great. Okay. Yeah, so that was just a syntax error that I made. Is we actually don't want that slash on public. That's going to send it to the wrong place. But instead, so just public without that slash there. And now when we go to the root of our domain here, we can see we get our lovely website that we made. Great. And now what we can do, it's going to be our last thing, and we can wrap this up, is we can just go back to our GET request that we're working on here. And now, because we're on the same domain, we can just point directly to /counter in our GET request. And great. And now we can see our counter going. Look at that. And now what's kind of fun about this is, like, say I open a second browser and I go over here to localhost 3000. So, like, sure, that's increasing each time, but then I go over here, and these are going to stay in sync because they're both looking at that same server. Although they'll actually always be off by 1 because they aren't updating. But you get the idea. Cool. But yeah, thanks for tuning in, guys.